Now, in this section, we'll be dealing with the dating methods that are devised for the identification of any bony remains that we have at our hand. So it is very important, and these dating methods have been devised to basically calculate the time and the eras that basically these bones belong to. So they are very interesting, and basically they involve the environmental factors that basically come into play whenever we are dating any bones. And this is basically of more importance to an archaeological point of view. But if the time since death is smaller, it can be forensically important as well. So these methods which are devised are the accumulated degree day method. Now, the significance of this degree day method is basically it involves the environmental features that come into play whenever the decomposition of the body is taking place after death. It basically, as you already know, if we have the atmospheric temperature are more moist, then the mummification of the body can occur. And this causes these degree day methods. They have their own scoring methods, and they're devised, and the time since death can be calculated through these degree day methods through tables and formulas that are devised. So the physical appearance of the bones is very important whenever we are calculating the time since death. Here we have the definition for the accumulated degree day method. It's basically a scoring method for the decomposition using a point-based system taking into account the temperatures to which the remains were exposed for prolonged periods of time. So this is basically the significance. It is also, the degree day method is also taking into account the environmental conditions, the temperatures that the body was exposed to after the death. So that is very important, and it obviously affects the decomposition of the body. And so it is a very likely method whenever we are calculating the time since death. So here is a chart basically which is involving the scoring system. On the left hand side, we have the scores that were devised from 1 to 13, and depends upon, here we have the head and neck features. For example, if we have fresher head and neck with no discoloration, the scoring is 1. If we have fresher trunk with no discoloration, the scoring is again 1. And if we have limbs with fresh appearance with no discoloration, the scoring is again 1. So on the other hand, if we move on to the score 7, it's basically the caving in of the flesh and the tissues of the eyes and throat. So it's basically the decomposition that is taking place along with the scoring system that is in basically an ascending order. So it has basically, the more mummified the body is, the more the score is on this accumulated degree day method. So it's basically a directly proportional relationship between these scorings and these changes that are occurring in the head and neck, in the trunk, and in the limbs in the third column. So that is basically the mainstay to this degree day method accumulations that are taking place. Now, moving on to the physical appearance, we can have recent bones at our hand, and the soft tissue remnants are adhering to these obviously recent bones. There is going to be a lot of flesh, a lot of blood to these bones, and in the form of the tendon and the ligament tags, as you can see. The muscles can be attached in a lot of cases. The periosteum may be visible as fibrous material closely adherent to the shaft surface. So these recent bone appearances have to be kept in mind, and that basically indicate a time since death that is not too long. These physical appearances are very important. Now, time for which these remnants persist is variable. So we again have to basically take into account all of these remnants, all of these bony pieces that we have at our hand, for what time period they have been preserved, what were the conditions, the environmental conditions, the geographical conditions, and topographically how it is important, what was important at that time, which was preserving these remnants to be there and to be available. The recent bone with no tissues is identified with its density and the feel of the bone. So a more fresher bone is basically harder and it is more denser because it has its osteological matrix quite intact, and the feel is slightly greasy to the fingers after several years. It feels quite heavy compared with the older skeletal materials because the older skeletal materials won't have the histological and the osteological matrix intact, so it will be much lighter. On sawing, hard and uniform through the whole thickness, and a characteristic burning smell will be there for the fresher bones only. Then the smell of the burning and the older bones, on the other hand, will have the loss of the collagenous stroma. So basically there will be a drastic change and it will be on the opposite side of the table. The lightens, basically as the bone grows older, it becomes lighter because of the loss of the osteological characteristics, and it is easier to cut an older bone rather than a fresher bone. The outer cortex loses the stroma first, and there will be a sandwich effect which will be seen. When we say there is a sandwich effect, it basically corresponds to the presence of a harder material in between the bones, and on either side there are more brittle and fragmentary remains at the bony parts. So it's basically a sandwich of the harder bone in between, and the softer fragmentary bones are on either side, up and on the down sides as well. So it's basically forming a sandwich, and that's why it's known as the sandwich effect that occurs as the bones grow older. They are more fragile and they are more brittle in their appearances. So what is basically the physical appearance? That is very important. It involves the size and the type of the bone. So what bone we have at our hand, it's very important. If we have the skull at our hand, we have to identify the ancestral characteristics of the skull, of course, and then we have to identify the time for which this skull was exposed to what temperature effects. This is very important. The thick, dense bone, such as the femoral or the humeral shaft, it can last for several centuries. And the smaller, thinner items, they disintegrate very rapidly. Now, these smaller and thinner items basically they include the skull plates, and they also include the tarsal and the carpal bones. The digits and the thin bones of the facial skeletons are also involved. For example, the nasion apertures and the digitalis bones, they are involved in these thinner and more smaller items. For example, the clavicle is even smaller enough and it won't remain for that longer periods of time. So in this section, basically, we dealt with the ancestral remains of and how are we going to get back to the facial reconstruction and the time since death these bones have been exposed to particular environmental conditions. This is very important, and the degree day accumulation method is the highlight of this section. That was the end to this section. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.